Have you ever said something that's come back to bite you in the butt? That happens in this particular election cycle, but it doesn't affect the outcome of this particular election. Now, most of the time when I'm doing these inauguration speech analyses, there's normally a lot of backdrop and context that provides some interesting direction and nuance to the speech that we end up looking at. And I've got to say, this is the first example where I think the build up to the election actually doesn't feed very much into the speech. Essentially, the US went for the same again with this election. They had 8 years of Reagan, and then they said, okay, do we want something that's just like Reagan, or do we want something different? And in the end, they pretty conclusively chose, let's just have more of the same. They chose Reagan's vice president, H.W. Bush. He won very convincingly in the election. He won over 400 electoral college votes. And actually, that's the last election that's ever happened. And over 400 is considered to be an electoral landslide. So this is the last ever landslide election. It starts to get closer and closer from this point on. And as I said, there's not much interesting in the build up to the election. Probably what's a little bit more interesting is what we don't see in this election that plays a part in the future. Now, H.W. Bush, during one of his speeches in one of the debates, says, "Read my lips, no new taxes." That doesn't affect him in this election, but remember that phrase for a later inauguration speech analysis. There's also some people who aren't in this election cycle. Now we have H.W. Bush, who of course is the father of a future president, George Bush. Keep up with the Bushes. What's more interesting is when you start to look at the Democratic candidates. In the end, they went for Michael Dukakis. But they could have gone for a young senator from Arkansas. However, he ruled himself out the race. But you're going to see that young senator from Arkansas very soon. Someone else who officially ran was Al Gore, the vice president to that young senator from Arkansas you're going to see very soon. And there was another candidate who also ran. However, he got caught out plagiarizing a speech from the UK Labour Party leader. His name was Joe Biden. You'll be seeing him later on in these US elections. So not much really happens in this election. George Bush very much positions himself as the status quo. The US want the status quo, and that's the only really context that you're going to have for when we look at this speech, is George Bush is going to be promising essentially more of the same, but just a different tinge, an evolution and a change to more of the same. Now, as always, the footage that I'm using in this video is not mine. I do not claim the rights to it. I'd like to thank C-SPAN on this particular occasion for providing the footage. The use of this footage is for informational and educational purposes only. So with that disclaimer and that context scene set up and out of the way, let's look at H.W. Bush's inauguration.
I've just repeated, word for word, the oath taken by George Washington 200 years ago. And the Bible on which I placed my hand is the Bible on which he placed his.
Right at the beginning here, Bush is anchoring his credibility to George Washington, the founding father, the first president. When you quote someone, in this case taking the exact same oath, or when you align yourself with someone, for example, using George Washington's Bible, when there is someone who is placed on a pedestal, someone who's a role model, someone who's an expert, some people who someone looks up to, you get some of their credibility rub off on you. They go, oh yeah, I like those words, I like you. I like that thing, I like you. So right at the beginning here, Bush is using a clever tactic to position himself alongside someone like George Washington, someone who's looked up with reverence, someone who's been seen as being a strong leader, someone who's led the country through turmoil, and we start to get that impression being linked with H.W. Bush.
Would, I think, be gladdened by this day, for today is the concrete expression of a stunning fact. Our continuity, these 200 years since our government began. We meet on democracy's front.
What we can see is that Bush isn't just looking down into his notes, he's not looking up at a teleprompter, he's not even picking a fixed point and just speaking to it. We're seeing a lot of engagement, looking around the audience and finding parts of the audience to look into. Now, from where he's standing, he's not going to be able to make out individual faces, but he is trying to make sure that all parts of those audience are feeling engaged and included. And that's something that we want to do with our speeches as well. Now, we're probably not going to be in the position of standing on some high, lofty podium where we can't see our audience. We're a little bit more mere mortal than that. But we can take the same principle of when we're on stage, trying to find those different faces in the audience, front, back, right, left, in the middle, on the edges, trying to make sure all of the audience feel like they are a part of the speech. And Bush is doing that really well. Again, we're in the first couple of minutes here, so really trying to build up that engagement, getting the audience into the speech as he builds into the rest of his content.
Years since our government began. We meet on democracy's front porch.
I like that. Democracy's front porch. It's combining the grandiose with the everyday. So democracy is this big, lofty notion. It's this driving, fundamental thing that we all strive for as nations. At the moment, it's the best way that we've got of governing our societies. So democracy is this big picture concept. And then we've got front porch, which is quaint and nice, personal, intimate. So it's taking this big idea and it's connecting it to something small and everyday that we can buy into, that we can see ourselves in. So a really nice juxtaposition of large and small, conceptual and concrete.
Thick as a fog, you sit and wait, hoping the mist will lift and reveal the right path. But this is a time when the future seems a door you can walk right through into a room called tomorrow. Great.
Walking through a door into a room called tomorrow. This is something very visual. We start to see ourselves walking along there. What you're trying to do when you're delivering a leadership speech, and all speeches are leadership, but especially this context of leadership, is you've got to paint the big picture, but you've also got to add the detail of, okay, this is the grand vision of where we're going, and these are the steps that we take to get there. And what we're getting here is, again, it's that juxtaposition of large and small, of conceptual and concrete. So when we're talking about tomorrow, we're talking about the future, we're talking about vision, possibility, aspiration. How can we make that more visual and more real for people? Well, we talk about walking through a door into a new room. You can see that, can't you? You can see yourself being in a room and saying, I don't really want to be in this room. I want to be in another room. And you can visualize that act of walking through the door. That door is opening up to something new and better, in this case tomorrow. So again, it's another nice visual technique that George Bush is using here to allow him to describe the big picture of what he's talking about, but to present it in a way that's going to connect with the audience and help them to visualize and understand it.
Great nations of the world are moving toward democracy through the door to freedom. Men and women of the world move toward free markets through the door to prosperity. The people.
What we're seeing there is now the repetition of that visual. So once you've got something in the audience's mind, you can then use that image to anchor ideas, and you can use that image to help them understand other concepts that you're talking about. So as Bush is talking about different geopolitical scenarios, contexts, rather than getting all very big picture and heady, he's saying, okay, I've used this visual to anchor one big concept. Let's rely on that visual to tie in different ones. And so we're starting to get this visual of walking through the different doors, and we can start to see other people from different parts of the country, from other countries, walking through those doors as well. Once you've established an image in your audience's mind, don't just use it once, because with that visual, it then helps you to explain other key ideas, other key concepts. When you come up with an effective metaphor, when you come up with a catchy slogan, use it repeatedly, use the strength of it multiple times to buttress the strength of your speech.
We must act on what we know. I take as my guide the hope of a saint. In crucial things, unity. In important things, diversity. In all things, generosity.
If you have watched a single one of the other inauguration analyses, you'll know that every single time a rule of three comes up. It's just, you almost can't do these speeches without a rule of three. Now, maybe that will happen in the future, but at the moment, a rule of three has come up consistently. Talking about the rule of three, it's the lowest number we recognize as a pattern. It draws our attention and focus to those three things. So rather than just saying, oh, this should be crucial and we should do things together and that's really good. Instead, we go in da-da-da-da, 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 and there's a rhythm and a pattern to that, again, if you get into the neuroscience of this, starts to set off the little dopamine reactors in our brain. Our brain likes patterns because patterns usually mean leading to something good. For example, if you go all the way back to our kind of primal days, if we saw an animal's tracks in the woods, we would go, there's an animal here, this is something that we can hunt. You'd have to recognize that pattern in order to get to the reward at the end. And our brains still work in this pretty primal way, to be honest with you. And that's why the rule of three works. Our brain likes patterns. And when we see our pattern, our part of our brain lights up, pays more attention to it, focuses on that key idea you're sharing at that moment of the speech.
Of all the community organizations that are spread like stars throughout the nation doing good, we will work hand in hand.
I mentioned earlier on about how we had good eye coverage in the speech. What we're seeing here is starting to take in even more. We actually get the little turn from Bush, perhaps catching those members of the audience who are parked right out over at the side of the audience. Remember also that on that presidential podium, you have all of the elites who are sitting up there, all the fancy folks. And actually, when you deliver the speech to the masses, you do have your backs to them. And that is the way that it should be. But taking that little turn to include some far members of the audience in front of you, but also start to engage some of the audience behind you. Now again, this is a situation we won't find ourselves in that often. Normally, the audience are always positioned quite directly in front of you. But sometimes you can have a bit more of a half circle audience where you do have to turn to the side to get folks. And you may find yourself in the situation where you are doing some kind of 360 speech. And then you've got to think about, okay, who are some folks behind me who might want to be included in the speech at one particular point. So really fantastic eye coverage from Bush as he's speaking here.
The old ideas are new again because they're not old. They are timeless. Duty, sacrifice, commitment, and a...
You know it already? It's the rule of three, isn't it? Duty, sacrifice, commitment. He's not asking two things out of his government. He's not asking four things out of his government. He's asking three things. Three is the magic number. If you list 10 things, people forget them. If you list 2 things, it doesn't really stick because we don't see it as a pattern. But when you hit that magic 3 number, it sticks with the audience, draws their attention to it, and makes the point more powerful. If he's asking 10 different things of the government, we go, well, okay, like what's important? What's really going to make the difference? but 3 things, well, now we know what's important, and it's therefore implied that these are the things that will make the difference.
That war cleaves us still. But friends, that war began in earnest a quarter of a century ago. And surely the statute of limitations has been reached. This is a fact.
This is a fact, and this is a first. I believe this is the first time I've ever seen a joke being made in the inaugural address. And I'm all here for it. I'm quite pleased to see a little bit of humor and a little bit of levity come in. Certainly looking at some of the earlier renditions of inauguration speeches, when we were looking at stuff from, gosh, we started off in the 30s with FDR and then looking into the 40s, the 50s, and even the 60s, the inaugural address was quite sort of intellectual and heady and rational. There wasn't so much emotion coming through it. And humor is one of our most powerful emotions that we use to connect with each other. So bringing in a joke, a little bit of levity, now not turning this into some kind of after dinner speech. We don't want this type of speech to look like that. But recognizing that there is the opportunity for humor, there is the opportunity for levity to stir different emotions throughout this speech. So I'm really glad to see this as a first. Now, it didn't really land as a joke. You don't hear people going ha 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 ha. But it does have a little bit of a lighter lift to it in this part of the speech. And that's what jokes, even just moments of levity, they don't have to be like stand-up comedy, ba-boom, boom, shh. When you bring that levity into certain parts of your speech, you then create this motion and rhythm where when you bring things up a little bit, you can bring them back down. When you bring it up a little bit, you can bring them back down. So if you're talking about some serious, intense subjects and you just go down in there and you stay there, it can get really heavy and people can start to struggle to keep up and struggle to continue to focus on it. It just goes so down, it flatlines so much. But when you get those little sparks, it brings people back up, brings their emotions back up, re-engages their attention, and that gives you that opportunity to then go back into the serious stuff, back into the heavy stuff, and then people are able to engage with it more and process it better.
In crucial things, unity.
Callback. We heard about in crucial things, unity earlier on. When you're looking at structure of a speech, I know this sounds obvious, is about all of your speech fitting together. So your speech shouldn't sound like 3 different speeches or 5 different speeches or even 2 different speeches. You want it to sound like a speech that is all as one. That if you take any piece out of that speech, then the speech no longer works. And a way that you link together your speech is to have callbacks linking something nearer the beginning of your speech to something nearer the end of your speech. So it's kind of like creating these arches. If you imagine your speech like a bridge, if you just kind of build the planks out into the water, they're not going to be very strong and they're going to fall in. But if you build the planks out and then you have those arches that bring them together, that hold the shape and hold the strength, then that allows your bridge to be a lot stronger and it allows people to actually travel across. If you think of your speech as a journey, you are building that bridge for your audience to go on that journey. And those callbacks are like those arches. They're saying, okay, remember this thing we talked about at the beginning? This is how it links in and this is how it ties in to something we're talking about later on, whether it's in the middle, whether it's at the end. Using callbacks allows you to structure and link all of your speech together. So if you say something really great in the start of your speech, again, don't just leave it there gathering dust. Use the power of that great thing that you said to add power to another part of your speech. This, I think, is a theme that's emerging from looking at this particular speech, is when you use a good technique, don't just like use it and then forget about it. Use it and reuse it again in your speeches.
But take my word for it, this scourge will stop.
We've got good punchy, forceful line there. This scourge will stop. We've got a little bit of that repetitive sound in there. Forgetting what a sound is. Scourge will stop. So that little repetition, it attracts the attention in our brain. Scourge will stop. Got that use of the vocal intonation, adding some of that force and punchiness to it. And even this scourge will stop. We're not saying this inconvenience will halt. That stop, it's got that plosive t sound in it. So that t, it almost sounds like an attack. The scourge will stop. And it sounds like you're attacking the problem head on. So we've got the sound and the word choice coming through, the vocal intonation with the strong, punchy delivery, and the audience applauds at the end of that. So you can see that that line has the desired effect of positioning Bush as someone, okay, this is someone who looks and sounds like a strong, decisive leader with conviction on the issues and challenges that we have to face.
I do not fear what is ahead, for our problems are large, but our heart is larger. Our challenges are great, but our will is greater. And if our flaws are endless, God's love is truly boundless. Some see
we're seeing a mixed technique there. So we've got the rule of three, but it's a more complex rule of three. We're actually seeing a juxtaposition there. We've got a challenge, solution, or problem, solution. So Bush outlines, well, here are three problems that we have, and how do we confront those three problems? When you're in a position of leadership, the audience want to know two things. They want to know that you understand the problems that are facing them. If you are going to, let's say, a bunch of minimum wage workers, and you're saying, hey, look, you can be an entrepreneur, you can do anything you like, you can earn $1 million, £1 million a year. You don't show that you understand the problems of that audience. So the first thing before anyone will buy into you as a leader is you've got to demonstrate that you understand what those problems are. But you can't just be in a position of sympathy of, yeah, I know, so it's really tough. I know you struggle to make ends meet. I know you sometimes have to make difficult choices between essential things in your life. And I know that it seems that you can't get the skills and experience and opportunities to create a better life for yourself. That's really tough. You can't just end it there. Yes, it's nice to have that understanding and that appreciation, that sympathy, but when it comes to leadership, people want you to solve their problems. Well, at least they want you to show them how to solve their problems. They want to go, okay, well, how do I solve these problems? Sure, you understand them. So if you understand what I'm going through right now, surely you understand what I need to do to get to where I want to be. And that's where you need to outline the solutions. And that's what's contained in this little portion of the speech. And we're coming right to the end here. We're almost at the final lines. And this technique outlines really nicely and sums up in 6 ideas. That's all it takes. Here are the problems and here are the solutions. Understand where you are as a leader and understand how to get you to where you want to be as a leader. That's what people want to hear, and that's what Bush delivers with this portion of the speech. We've just looked there at what Bush was doing well in his inauguration speech. But as I hinted at the beginning of the video, there was one line he would come to regret. And it wasn't delivered in his speech itself, it was something that he said in his election campaign. Read my lips, no new taxes. We want to make sure that in your speeches, you're executing all of the great techniques that Bush was in his speech, but then you aren't saying a line you'll later come to regret and will bite you in the butt. And that's where coaching with me can help you. If you have a speech that you're working on, or if you have a desired outcome you're working towards through your speaking, then working with me as a coach can help you to highlight all of those great skills and help you to avoid those pitfalls and mistakes. So you'll see basically what we do outlined in this video. We'll look at, first of all, what are you doing well as a speaker already? What are your strengths, what are your skills, and how are we going to lean into that and double down on what is already good for you and is helping you stand out. And then looking at, well, what are those areas that we need to sharpen up and improve, any kind of mistakes and slip-ups that we want to remove and eradicate from your speaking. To find out more about my coaching and the different types of services and processes that can help you, I've put a link to my LinkedIn in the video description. If you just send me a message on there, outline what you're wanting to do if you're speaking, what your desired outcomes are, and we can find a coaching program that works best for you. Now let's look at how H.W. Bush could have avoided a few more mistakes and pitfalls in his inauguration speech.
For this is a day when our nation is made whole, when our differences for a moment are suspended. And my first act as president is a prayer. I ask you to bow your heads. Heavenly Father, we
rushed into that prayer a bit. We're 2 minutes into the speech, and now Bush is asking the entire audience to do something, to engage in an activity. That's what you can see this as. This is like a workshop activity in a different setting or scenario. When you're going into the first thing you're asking of your audience, you need to build into it a little bit more, and you need to have a gentle lead up into it. Bush here is going, right, okay, so let's put our differences aside, right, say a prayer, bow your heads, for hell of it. It's too fast, it's too quick. He isn't providing the transition time from listener mode into participant mode. He isn't providing that feed up time from speech to prayer. It switches too fast. Remember this when you're engaging your audience in some kind of activity or interaction like this, especially the first one. You've got to lead into it. You've got to showcase and provide a trailer. Okay, this is what's going to happen. This is what we're about to do. And then allow some transition time to go into that activity. Don't jump into it the way Bush jumps into this prayer.
Hands hard. If not, in fact, the day of the dictator is over.
So Bush gets caught by surprise there. He says a line and he doesn't think that it's going to get an applause, and it does. And we've seen this happen in other inauguration speeches. And I would say it's not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes you plan to have this really kind of punchy mic drop moment line, and you deliver the line. What you say next? And then other times there's almost just like this throwaway comment, and that's what the audience resonates with. So it's okay if this happens. However, it does happen a couple of times in this speech. And what I think you've got to do, especially when you're leading into the speech, is give yourself time to work out where the audience are at a little bit. Because Bush delivers the line there, and there is like a micro pause. But a micro pause isn't enough time for the audience to react. You've got to hold that pause longer and then move on to the next point. Because even if you don't necessarily get the applause in that moment, you still get the power of that statement sinking in. The day of the dictator is over. That is still a punchy statement, and you still want that to land with the audience. So having that longer pause is still going to have a good effect, even if the applause doesn't fill into the pause. So that micro pause, it wasn't enough time for Bush to react to how his line had engaged with the audience. And it's a mistake that he makes a couple more times throughout this speech.
Free speech, free elections, and the exercise of free will unhampered by the state.
You see, he gets caught out again there, doesn't he? And actually that line that he'd built up into, free speech, free elections, free will, we've got that rule of three here. It's something that's punchy. So that statement would have still benefited from that little bit of an elongated pause for the point to sink in. And even if the applause doesn't fill the pause, it still allows the audience to process what's going on. And so we're starting to see here, we're nearly 5 minutes into the speech, Bush is slow to adapt to his audience and how they're responding to the speech. And I think what could be happening here is he could be in his speech rather than in the moment. Do you notice there was that little bit of a slip up through speech? He had to correct himself. And I think in that moment, he's thinking so much about what he's going to say rather than just allowing himself to say it. When you get focused on your speech, you can deliver a speech kind of word perfect, and you can even have sort of the delivery aspects of I'm doing this gesture at this particular time and the intonation on this particular word, and you can execute a speech well, but it can still not have the desired effect because you're almost delivering the speech in a silo of this is me and I'm doing my speech and here's my thing and here's the technique. But speeches require an audience. Speeches work best when they are being spoken with the audience rather than to the audience. And I think what's happening here is Bush is in the speech too much of this is what I've got to say and this is how I've got to say it and this is the thing that I want to do in this moment, rather than just being, okay, hi everyone, here is my speech, and being with the audience at that time. Because if your attention and direction is focused out more towards the audience, that's when you'll start to pick up the cues and pick up the vibe, all these like really fluffy words, I know, but you'll start to resonate with, okay, I think when I say this line, the audience is going to respond in this way. And in order to get that connection and build that rapport, you've got to almost get out of your speech a little bit rather than being focused inward on your speech. And I think that's what happens here. And I think that's why Bush makes the mistake again.
We cannot hope only to leave our children a bigger car, a bigger bank account. We must hope to give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend.
That for me was building into something good and then just kind of trailed off. So we had the kind of the resonance and the intonation coming through. Oh, we don't just want to leave them a bigger house and a bigger car and a bigger bank account. And I was like, all right, fantastic. What is the bigger thing we're going to leave them? We want to leave them with a sense of purpose. And it's not punchy enough for me. And I think what we had there was we could have had the repetition and then a juxtaposition of bigger, 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 but this is the stuff we don't want. And let's have something bigger instead. Let's leave them with a bigger heart. Let's leave them with a bigger set of values. Let's leave them with a bigger sense of duty and responsibility. Like, you can basically say the same thing, but use the same rhythm and the same word choice that you've built into it with already. So that for me, it kind of builds into something and then it really loses momentum quite quickly rather than building into something and then nailing the punchline.
But if the man you've chosen to lead this government can help make a difference, if he can celebrate the quieter, deeper successes that are made not of...
I am not a fan of people speaking of themselves in third person in a speech. Don't say the man that you've made president. We know who you've made president. Like, it's me. Like, take ownership of that. Say, I know you've put your faith in me as president. And then the next thing he says also bugs me. He goes on to talk about in the third person of the man that you put into place as president. If he can do it, well, a woman could be president. I know she hasn't been yet, but she could be. So not only has he gone out of third person, but he's also made that position of leadership unattainable for some. It's going, well, okay, the only person that will ever put faith in is a man. More than half the audience are women. More than half of the population are women. So when you talk about a man, you're not speaking to the woman at the same time. So there was no need for him to go into the third person there. Just say, you've put your faith in me as president. And I do happen to be a man, and that's okay. That's who you voted for on this occasion. But to then go into third person and then to make that position of leadership exclusionary for some, to remove the aspiration for over half the people you're speaking to, and that for me is it's a big blunder. I don't like speaking in third person. And then he doubles down and compounds that error with then how he expresses talking about leadership in the third person.
One might say that our new relationship in part reflects the triumph of hope and strength over experience. But hope is good, and so is strength and vigilance. Here today,
that whole bit for me, the rhythm is just totally off. This part of the speech sounds like he's just making it up on the spot. There's the da 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 da. Oh, and this is good. I'm thinking, strength is good, and that part of the speech, it sticks out like a very sore tongue. That's the speech metaphor for a very sore thumb. I hope you like it. But the rhythm of it, it goes totally off. It's very kind of like smooth and da da da, and then it drops down a beat, but then it pings up and then it bounces about. So I don't know what happened with this part of the speech. I don't know if Bush actually forgot a line here, and he maybe said one thing before he was supposed to say the other, and he bounced back again. Whether that was just how the speech was written, but they hadn't really gone through a speak-through of that part of the speech. If you are using a scripted approach to a speech, whether it's that word-for-word script, which I don't particularly recommend, but it does sometimes get used, or if you're using a little bit of a hybrid of some things are a little bit more open, loosey-goosey, some things are a little bit more tight and scripted, you've got to make sure that when you are scripting parts of your speech, do a speak through of those, because the way that we write and the way that we read is different to the way that we speak and the way that we listen. And sometimes you'll see someone who is delivering a part of their speech and you can tell it's written in the writing voice. It's meant to be read. And when you say it out loud, it doesn't sound like how someone speaks in real conversation. And that could be what's happening here as well. I think it's just a badly written part of the speech. I don't think you could save those lines with better delivery, and the delivery is a little bit off. It's a strange misstep in what actually, I think Bush throughout his speech actually shows, generally speaking, a very good rhythm, apart from those points where there's a little bit of applause that he's not expecting. So he's built himself a rhythm and getting into the flow of things, and it's strange that he should be losing that flow closer to the end of the speech. You would think that maybe that flow wouldn't quite be there in the beginning of the speech. So it's a strange part of the speech, and it doesn't sound very good, and there's a couple of reasons why it might not sound very good.
that we are all part of a continuum, inescapably connected by the ties that bind. Our children are watching in schools throughout our great land, and to them I say, thank you.
I think there's rarely a moment in a speech where you can say them and not you. You is more personal. When you say I say to them, why say to them? Why not just say to you? To you, the children who are watching, because children will be watching. Look, you can see the camera panning over some young people right there. I say to them, or I thank them for their service. It's quite an impersonal way of doing things. You is a lot more direct. It feels a lot more personal. So never address a group or a person in your speech as them. Talk about you. Speak to them directly. It feels more personal. It feels more warm. It feels more intimate. Overall, what we've got with this speech is something that doesn't really shake the rafters too much. There isn't very many parts of the speech that are particularly bold, talking about drastic change, talking about doing things different. We've got very much the status quo speech here. Throughout the past few decades, we saw a lot of kind of back and forth between different ideologies of presidents. Whereas here we've just really got a lot more of the same. So I don't think there's quite as much meat and quite as much substance, perhaps in terms of the future-orientated content of really having to try and persuade and win over people with your speech. This is more of a reassurance and a safety speech. We're seeing some nice techniques coming through here, seeing a good rhythm to Bush's speech. We're seeing a couple of new ideas being put in. I'd say that Eye contact with the audience is something that we haven't seen from past presidents, of thinking more about delivering this as a speech to real people rather than just reciting a script off the podium. Also seeing a joke, we're also seeing a bit more of a personal touch here, a bit more of levity to the kind of intellectual, serious, geopolitical viewpoint of a lot of the previous inauguration speeches. Got a few areas that could be sharpened and tied up here, but I'd say that this speech isn't remembered as one of the classics, and there's a reason for that. The context in which it is delivered isn't really the fertile ground for some of that to come out. We don't have an FDR in the Great Depression. We don't have a JFK kind of at the peak of the Cold War. We're coming pretty much to the end of the Cold War now. America is in a period of pretty much economic prosperity right here. There isn't that much social issues and social injustice that's coming to the fore. Sure, there's stuff that's underneath, under the surface. So in the end, a fairly safe speech. And you know what? Sometimes you're only trying to deliver a safe speech. Not every speech is trying to be the revolutionary, aspirational, let's go and do this speech. Sometimes you just need that kind of bread and butter speech. Sometimes you need a speech where it's like, okay, this is what we need to do. This is what we need to tick off. And then you go through and you deliver that type of speech and you execute it well. Not every speech will be revolutionary, but you do need to have the power to have a revolutionary speech in your arsenal. And I'm not entirely sure that Bush would have had that revolutionary speech in his arsenal. We're going to see another change speech coming up in the future, because this status quo is not going to last. And we're going to see a callback and a return of someone who we had a brief cameo of this time. And we're going to see another callback of a line that Bush did not want repeated. Tune in for next time.